One Health people are quite focused on zoonotic diseases, and it's fairly dominated by vets. There's nothing wrong with that, but the vets are in the One Health camp. Then there are people who talk about it as being a cooperation between different disciplines in terms of prevention, surveillance, response, control, etc. Again, focus a lot on zoonotic diseases. And the WHO talks about it as being an approach to designing and implementing programs, policies, legislation and research in which different sectors communicate and work together to achieve better human health outcomes. And other groups will talk about it as being an approach to optimising health for people, animals and the environment. And then people talk about it more broadly in terms of climate, ecosystems, economics, etc. So there are many different interpretations of what this means, but essentially it's a holistic, multidisciplinary approach that considers humans in the context of the environment and other living things. So I think we should sort of think about it like that, regardless of what we call it. And there are related terms like environmental health, eco-health, planetary health, and people have even written a paper comparing what those different terms kind of mean. They're slightly different, and the different people belong to those different clubs. We call it clubs, but really it's the same concept. So there are lots of diagrams like this if you're searching Google under One Health and images. This one I thought was quite nice for this particular meeting because it talks about all the different disciplines that fit into the different spaces here, and I think we have most of those covered, plus maybe hopefully a few more. So my big interest in One Health is in emerging infectious diseases, and zoonoses account for more than 60% of emerging infectious diseases. And human activities are actually the most potent factors driving disease emergence and outbreaks. So I'm sure you've all seen news items like this over the last few years of quite dramatic zoonotic disease outbreaks around the world. So things like SARS, Ebola, Zika, bird flu, swine flu, etc. So these can be really, big dramatic events, and One Health and the associated groups are quite involved with emerging infectious diseases for obvious reasons. So there are many different drivers of infectious disease transmission, and these are things related to the natural environment, so things like climate, natural disasters, environmental degradation, things like vegetation, soil, geography, hydrology, animals, insects, biodiversity, ecology, etc. But there are also lots of drivers related to humans and what we do. So population growth is a really big driver, urbanisation and land use, environmental contamination, how we manage and deal with our animals, culture, behaviour, lifestyle, consumerism, health services, economics, politics, etc. One thing that sometimes gets forgotten and becoming increasingly important is globalisation and our interconnectedness with the world. So one of the things that I work in is travel medicine, and travellers are a big contribution to emerging infectious diseases and the way in which they spread around the world. So this is just a nice little picture showing transportation clusters around the world and between the different continents. So we're really very, very interconnected, and this has a lot to do with the spread of outbreaks around the world. So this nice paper here, the hidden geometry of complex network-driven contagion phenomena. So the mathematicians will be interested in this. So this shows not geographic distance, but effective distance between the start of an outbreak and the number of days it's taken to spread to these different places. So that's the spread of swine flu from Mexico and the spread of SARS from China. So this is to do with social network analyses, but based on the degree of connectivity. So what's eco-epidemiology? So for the epidemiologists in the room, time, place, person, those are the key elements. But eco-epidemiology also takes into account the interplay between the natural and the economic and the social systems with time, place and person. And it's supposed to acknowledge complex interactions in these dynamic systems and the associated uncertainty, unpredictability, instability, but we don't really do this very well at the moment in public health and eco-epidemiology of infectious diseases. And that's largely to do with our lack of good approaches and methods to deal with these complex things. So I just want to point out the importance of place in eco-epidemiology, and that's surprisingly poorly dealt with in public health research. So obviously there's a lot of spatial variation in place, and that's why spatial epidemiology is really important when we're talking about eco-epidemiology, but often that's just not really considered properly or not considered very well. And we also need to remember that place is dynamic, so things change over time. So things like climate, society, biodiversity loss, invasive species, etc. All these things change over time, but often when we're doing eco-epidemiology research, we just don't take that into account adequately. The other thing we need to think about is scale. So starting from the person to the household, community, up to the global levels, the pressures and drivers may operate at different scales and also influence things at each of the different scales differently. Again, that's often not really taken into account very well. So I'm just going to give an example of an eco-epidemiological study to a One Health problem. So this is a real-life field study that I led a few years ago, just to give you some idea of what we do in public health in the eco-epidemiology space. And it doesn't sound like, maybe apart from me and Phil, there are too many public health, and Javier, there are too many public health people here, maybe a few here. So I'm going to use leptospirosis as a disease as an example of a One Health problem. So this is the most common zoonotic disease in the world, and it's estimated there are over 1 million severe cases per year and about 60,000 deaths around the world, and it's probably an underestimate. And case fatality can be up to 30% in developing countries where we don't have good laboratory diagnosis and treatment. So the epidemiology is very complex, and there are very strong environmental drivers of disease transmission. And we often see outbreaks after floods, especially in the tropics and developing countries and islands. But not only in those places, it also happened in Queensland, where we had huge floods in 2011. And we had a big outbreak where we had more than double the number of usual cases. So what is leptospirosis? It's a bacterial infection caused by these tiny little spirochetes, spiral-shaped bacteria. And they can stay and survive in the environment, sometimes for weeks or even months. So the environment is kind of like a reservoir for this infection. But it is a zoonotic disease, so many species of animals can be reservoirs. In fact, every mammal species that has been tested, we have found leptospirosis in at least some of them. So when they become infected, their kidneys become colonized with these bacteria, and when they urinate, the bacteria get passed into the environment, can stay in the environment for weeks or months, and infect other animals of their own species and also other species. And then humans can become infected either through direct contact with soil or water, through an environmental exposure, or through direct contact with animals, especially in Australia through occupational risks, through agricultural work. But it's much more complex than that. So we have the standard environment, humans, animals, but we have lots of things that influence humans, animals, environment, and all the different things that influence the interactions between these things. And then, as Helen mentioned before, things like culture and much broader things and environmental things. So it's a really very complex system and many different things that drive disease transmission. So it's a really good example of a One Health problem. So going back to Fiji, this was 2012. There were 2 massive outbreaks of leptospirosis after 2 really big floods, and over 1,000 or over 1,200 cases, which is really big for a small country like Fiji. So after that, I was involved in a study to try and look at the eco-epidemiology of this disease, look at risk factors, environmental drivers, so that they can develop some evidence-based interventions to try and control this disease in Fiji. So the standard approach in public health is something like this. We usually do questionnaires looking at sort of fairly proximal factors, maybe do some blood tests, and look for a history of infection. So with this sort of approach, and the results are not important here, we get results like, you know, infection rates by age, sex, different subgroups, and we can look at things like odds ratios for gender, so males are more likely to be infected, different ethnic groups, different community types, people working outdoors, having water at home, etc. So that's a kind of a fairly standard approach to these sorts of studies. However, we're missing all of these things here, which are much broader environmental drivers of disease transmission. So in order to do that, we need to use some other methods, think about it more broadly. One of the things is spatial epidemiology, and we can get a lot more information about the broader drivers with environmental data that are available through all sorts of different sources. So just as an example, these are some of the environmental data sets that we've had on Fiji, so things like rainfall, altitude, livestock density, poverty rate, other census data and socio-demographics. So by including spatial epidemiology, we can expand the number of things that we can actually look at when we're doing eco-epidemiological studies. Sorry, I can't say that word today. So the other thing we can do through spatial analysis, we can measure things like distances, buffers, count things within buffers, and all sorts of cool things that we would never be able to do if we just use questionnaires to ask a person what is, you know, what is your behaviour, what are your risk factors. So through that, we can map out things in a bit more of a spatially explicit way and look at infection rates more spatially. But also, more importantly, we can look at these sort of broader drivers of disease transmission. So, for example, people living closer to rivers are at high risk, people living in places with really high rainfall, in rural areas, areas of high poverty, high animal density, cattle, pigs, etc. So all of these are really important for public health interventions, and also all of these things are likely to get worse with time, with population growth and urbanisation and climate change and increase in agricultural activities and animals. So we really need to think bigger in terms of our prevention strategies, and one of the things that are also really important that we identified is that most of these factors, if you think about it, are really outside of the control of individuals or small communities. So we need people from sort of much higher levels of authority to be able to control some of these factors. So after that big outbreak in Fiji, at that time it was the largest outbreak in South Pacific. A few years later, 2016, this is Cyclone Winston, the largest ever cyclone in the Southern Hemisphere, and after that we had even larger outbreaks of leptospirosis in Fiji. So this is just going to get worse and worse with time. So just going back to the spatial epidemiology and what that adds to eco-epidemiology, if we do a standard sort of study without spatial components, we end up with some predictive variables, we collect some data, analyses, we have typical results like odds ratios and seroprevalence, maybe some risk charts. If we add spatial epidemiology, we can add quite a lot to our understanding of the eco-epidemiology of infectious diseases and sort of broaden our understanding of these One Health problems. So if we have locations of where people live, we have spatial data on a whole range of demographics and natural environmental factors. We can do some spatial analyses, we can do predictive risk mapping and make some risk maps. So that's just a very quick example of what we can do in eco-epidemiology of infectious diseases. But there are lots of limitations to these the approaches that we have in our discipline at the moment. It is quite difficult to assess the spatial variation in risk factors and drivers. Causality is also a big problem. Now, we can look at associations, but what are the actual causes? The interdependence between the covariates and more distal influences, including globalization, complexity, uncertainty, changes over time, scenario analysis, and feedback loops. So I think we have people from different disciplines here who would be much better at these things than we are in public health, and it would be great to discuss this. So we have explored some other methods to try and address some of these issues. So some of the work that Helen and I have done together using geographically weighted regression, so that takes into account that your risk factors actually vary over space and your environmental drivers actually vary over space. And we get interesting maps like this looking at actual spatial variations in the odds ratios of our covariates, which usually is not taken into account in the usual studies. We've also used Bayesian networks to try and look at leptospirosis in Fiji, so taking into account the strong correlation between predictor variables, which we typically can't do with the standard regression models. And we've had some quite interesting results from that. We've also explored the use of spatial Bayesian networks and trying to develop interactive and dynamic mapping tools. Social network analysis to look at interconnectivity, not just between different countries, but between small places within countries and within regions. So this is in the Samoan Islands, and how interconnectivity affects disease transmission in the context of disease elimination. And also mathematical models of disease transmission, looking at what happens over time, and also linking that with spatial epidemiology to look at spatial temporal changes over time. So just a few quick take-home messages. Really important to look at multidisciplinary and a holistic approach to human, animal and environmental health. And really important to consider scale and space and time when we look at eco-epidemiology. And we really do need more innovative approaches and methods, especially from the other disciplines. So I think we've got lots of opportunities to talk about that over the next day or two.